bad Messerschmitt, a story of triumph and tragedy. Hello, my dear subscribers and random guests of my channel. If you love aviation as much as I do, if you're ready to argue until you're hoarse about what's cooler, the yak or the Messer, and if stories about war, machinery, and human genius make your heart beat faster, you've come to the right place. Today, we're going to have a conversation about a very slippery topic. A provocative topic, a debate that hasn't subsided on aviation forums for about 80 years. We're going to talk about the aircraft that became the symbol of the Luftwaffe, about a machine that our grandfathers and great-grandfathers hated, but deep down respected for its capabilities. We're talking about the Messerschmitt Bf 109. But don't rush to slap on labels. I'm not going to sing odes to German engineering genius right now, nor am I going to drag it through the mud, as is often done in cheap public pages. I suggest we dig deeper, because the story of this aircraft isn't just a chronology of combat missions and victories. It's a story of incredible triumph and an equally incredible tragedy. A story of how a brilliant idea, born in the minds of sports enthusiasts, gradually, step by step, turned into a monster that its own creators could no longer control. It's a story about how politics, war, and human stubbornness can distort even the most beautiful engineering concept. We're used to hearing that the Bf 109 was the standard, a superfighter flown by famous aces with results that would make any rookie's head spin. 130 victories, 200, 350, Hartmann, Barkhorn, Nowotny, these names still resonate. And of course, a logical question immediately arises. If the plane was so good, why did Germany lose the air war? Why, by 43, had our pilots stopped being afraid of Messers? And by 44, were chasing them all over the sky? Maybe it wasn't just about numbers? Maybe there was something wrong with the plane itself? Maybe this beautiful, swift predator had a terrible disease in its genetic code from birth that ultimately killed it? Today, I invite you not just to listen to dry technical specifications. We will conduct a real analysis. I want you to imagine yourselves in the shoes of the German aircraft designer Willy Messerschmitt. Imagine an ambitious engineer who initially wasn't even allowed into military aviation, considered an upstart. Imagine how he, defying all the skeptics, creates an aircraft that becomes the foundation of the Third Reich's air power. And then imagine how this aircraft begins to crumble under the weight of its own success. We will journey together, from sports gliders and racing biplanes to the jet monsters of the war's end. We'll see how simple, seemingly logical decisions built into the design for lightness and cheapness became, a few years later, a death sentence for pilots. We'll talk about how the narrow landing gear track and weak strut strength killed pilots even during takeoff. How the single-spar wing, which Messerschmitt proudly advertised, at high speeds started playing cruel tricks with controllability. How the desire to shoehorn in a more powerful engine each time demanded bloody sacrifices. And, of course, we won't ignore the personality of Willy himself. Who was he? A brilliant visionary who was decades ahead of his time? Or a stubborn neurotic who, having found one successful design, exploited it to the point of exhaustion, unwilling to notice that the world had moved on? We'll examine his sporting roots, his approach to design, his conflicts with the aviation ministry, and most importantly, the price paid for his ambitions by thousands of young pilots. If you're ready to dive into this complex, contradictory, and incredibly fascinating world, stay with me. Our big investigation begins now. And, by the way, be sure to write in the comments at the very end, what do you think? Did the Bf 109 have a chance at a dignified old age? Or was it doomed from the start? Let's go. Chapter 1. The Sportsman Who Challenged the Generals. To understand why the Bf 109 turned out the way it did, we need to take a short excursion into history, specifically into the 20s and 30s of the last century. It was an amazing time, a time when aviation was transforming from the ugly duckling of the First World War into a beautiful swan. A time of records, races, and incredible enthusiasm. After World War I, Germany was forbidden from having a military air force, and this, oddly enough, played a huge positive role. German engineers and pilots, unable to build bombers and fighters, switched to civil aviation and, most importantly, to sports. And it was here, on sports airfields, that the future of the Luftwaffe was forged. Light, maneuverable gliders and aircraft for competitions were built. The main criteria were minimum weight, simplicity, low cost, and ease of maintenance. A racing plane isn't a military machine serviced by a regiment of technicians. Its owner, often also its pilot, had to repair it himself, transport it himself, and prepare it for the start himself. It was into this atmosphere that the young engineer Wilhelm Messerschmitt emerged. He had been passionate about aviation since his youth, built gliders, and by the age of 23 had founded his own company. His aircraft, such as the Bf 108 Typhoon, were true masterpieces of sporting design. They were light as a feather, had smooth skin, and excellent aerodynamics. And here we come to the most important point. When the Nazis came to power and began openly rearming, they announced a competition for a new fighter. Leading aviation firms Heinkel, Arado, Focke-Wulf submitted their projects. Messerschmitt initially wasn't even considered. The military saw him as an upstart with no experience in building combat aircraft. There was even an unofficial directive not to give Messerschmitt contracts for military aircraft because he wouldn't cope. So what did Messerschmitt do? He began work on a fighter on his own initiative, essentially investing his own money or funds from selling sports models. He ignored the military's opinions and built the aircraft the way he thought it should be built. And he thought it best to apply to a fighter all the principles he had so brilliantly refined on his sports planes. Imagine a typical early 30s fighter. It was usually a biplane with a multitude of struts, fixed landing gear, and an open cockpit. Messerschmitt proposed something completely different. An all-metal monoplane with an enclosed cockpit and retractable landing gear. But the most important part was inside. Chapter 2. Anatomy of a Contradiction, or How to Hide an Elephant in a China Shop. So, what was the Bf 109 like in terms of design? Imagine a Lego set. That's the most accurate comparison. Messerschmitt built his fighter on the principle of modularity. The heart of the aircraft was the so-called box, the central part of the fuselage containing the cockpit, fuel tank, and landing gear attachment points. To this box, the engine with its armament was attached at the front. The tail section was attached at the back. And on the sides, the two wing consoles were attached. Sounds brilliant, right? For production, it was ideal. You could produce wings at one factory, tails at another, engines at a third, and then assemble them like sausages on a conveyor belt. This reduced costs and sped up production manifold. Plus, it simplified repairs. Wing damaged in combat. Uncouple the old one, attach a new one, and the plane is back in service. It was a real breakthrough. But this metal had a flip side. This box was so densely packed with everything necessary that there was no free space left inside. The cockpit was cramped, like in a race car. Pilots complained that sitting in a Messer was like climbing into a pipe. Rearward visibility was terrible, especially on early models. To see what was behind, pilots literally had to twist around. But the main problem lay ahead. More precisely, under the aircraft. The landing gear. This was the Achilles heel of the 109 from day one until the very end. Messerschmitt, following his sports logic, attached the landing gear struts not to the wing, as most designers did, but to the fuselage, to that same box. This allowed the wings to be easily removed without jacking up the plane. It stood on its own legs. But because the fuselage was narrow, the struts ended up short, and the track was very narrow. Have you ever tried riding a bicycle where the wheels are almost touching each other? At low speeds, it will constantly tip over sideways. The same thing happened with the Bf 109. During taxiing, takeoff, and especially landing, the plane was unstable. The slightest gust of wind, a small bump on the runway, a clumsy control movement, and the Messer would fold its legs. The engine exacerbated the situation. The Germans bet on inverted V12 Daimler-Benz engines. They had several advantages. They improved forward visibility because the cowling was lower, and they lowered the center of gravity. But there was a problem. Because the propeller shaft was high up, the engine itself hung quite low. To avoid striking the propeller on the ground during takeoff and landing, the landing gear had to be made longer. Long, narrow struts attached to a weak point. This was a ticking time bomb. On early modifications, while the planes were light, this was tolerable. But the further it went, the worse it got. Chapter 3. Emile takes the stage. The first modifications, B, C, D, were essentially a test run of the idea. They flew on the Jumo 210 engine, producing around 700 horsepower. The planes turned out light, about 1.5 tons, and nimble. They performed well in Spain, where our pilots on I-16s and I-15s initially couldn't understand what new broom had arrived. But true fame came to the Messer with the advent of the DB601 engine. This was an engineering masterpiece. 1,100 horsepower in a compact, light, and reliable package. It instantly propelled the Bf 109 into the lead. The E modification, or Emile, became the first truly mass-produced Messer. But to install this engine, Messerschmitt had to resort to serious ingenuity. The new motor was more powerful but also hotter. It required a much more efficient cooling system. Where to put the radiators? There was no space left in the nose. Under the fuselage? That's where the box was packed to the gills. There was no room for ducts there, and no strong structural elements to attach a heavy radiator. And Messerschmitt made a Solomonic decision that became the calling card of all later Messers. He hung the radiators under the wings. On the sides, directly under the cockpit, two characteristic troughs appeared. From a layout perspective, it was convenient, but from an aerodynamic standpoint, it was a disaster. At the thickest part of the wing, where drag was already maximal, huge air intakes were added. It didn't prevent flying, but the speed potential was no longer what it could have been. Furthermore, the wings were no longer just simple removable consoles. They now contained plumbing, radiators, and shutters. The original concept of the empty, light wing had collapsed. But war is war, and they decided to turn a blind eye to this. The Emile was still very good. It was balanced. It might have lost in turning maneuverability to Hurricanes and our I-16s, but thanks to the powerful engine and excellent vertical performance, German pilots quickly learned to dictate combat terms. The swoop tactic, hit from above, zoom back up, worked flawlessly. Chapter 4. Friedrich. The peak of evolution or the first warning bell. The next modification, the Bf 109F, Friedrich, is considered by many historians and pilots to be the best in the line. And indeed, the Germans tried to fix the aerodynamic flaws of the Emile. They removed the tailplane struts, made the tailwheel retractable, and refined the cowling. The plane became even faster and more elegant. The radiators under the wings were made more streamlined and partially recessed into the wing. But it was here that the hidden flaws of the design began to manifest. Remember the single-spar wing? It was very strong in bending. The wings of the Messer could withstand colossal G-loads without breaking. In many photos of crash landings, you see, the engine is smashed, the fuselage is an accordion, but the wings are intact. That's a plus. However, a wing must withstand not only bending but also torsion. When the pilot deflects the ailerons, the wing must transmit this force rigidly, without twisting. And here, the Messer started having major problems. Because there was only one spar, and because huge cutouts were made in the wing for the wheel wells, and on the Friedrich, additional cutouts for the radiators, the wing's torsional stiffness became unacceptably low. Imagine a long plastic ruler. If you hold one end and try to twist it, it will twist easily. But if you take a similar ruler and glue a second one to its back, creating a kind of I-beam, it becomes much harder to twist. The Messer's wing was like that first ruler, strong, but easily twisted. At high speeds, this became a real problem. When the ailerons were deflected, the wing would start twisting in the opposite direction, negating the pilot's input. To try and fix this, engineers had to reduce the ailerons' effectiveness, making them small with minimal aerodynamic compensation. But this meant that at high speeds, the plane became wooden and barely responded to stick movements. Pilots said, at speeds around 600 kilometers per hour, to make a turn, you need muscles like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Meanwhile, the Focke-Wulf 190, with its rigid two-spar wing and frise ailerons, handled easily and predictably at such speeds. The Friedrich was the last harmonious modification. It had already shown that things couldn't continue this way. But the Germans, buoyed by the successes of the first 2 years of war, didn't notice this ominous warning. and that was a mistake. Chapter 5, Gustav, the monster created by the engine designers. 1942. The war in the East was becoming protracted. New Soviet aircraft appeared at the front, Yak-1, Yak-7, La-5, which were no longer inferior to the Messers and in many respects surpassed them. The Germans urgently needed to improve the performance of their main fighter. And then, like a gift from fate, Daimler-Benz delivered a new engine, the DB605. With the same dimensions as the 601, it produced almost 1,500 horsepower. A dream. It seemed like happiness was here. Just put the new engine in the proven Friedrich airframe and get a superfighter. Thus, the Bf-109G, the Gustav, was born. But reality, as always, was more complex and cynical. 1,500 horsepower isn't just power. It's heat, it's vibration, it's weight. And weight is the main enemy of a light sports plane. The Messerschmitts, especially the early Gustavs, started gaining weight rapidly. But the design remained the same, designed for much lighter machines. And then the real nightmare began. Remember the weak legs? Well, on the Gustav, they were falling off in batches. Every third Bf-109G crashed during takeoff or landing. Every third. That's monstrous statistics. The overloaded landing gear, designed for 1.5-ton planes, was now holding a 3-ton behemoth. Struts broke, braces bent, tires couldn't handle it. The plane became a hostage to good airfields. Operating Gustavs from the rough, unpaved fields of the Eastern Front turned into Russian roulette. A frantic effort began to strengthen the landing gear. They installed larger wheels, but they didn't fit in the old wells. They had to create characteristic bulges on the upper wing surface, pants or lumps, as pilots called them. This, in turn, worsened the aerodynamics again. The plane flew slower than it could. To compensate for the speed loss, they installed even more powerful, boosted engine versions. These weighed more, ran hotter, required even more cooling. Radiators were enlarged. Additional compressors and superchargers were hung on the engine, protruding from the cowling in ugly humps. The circle was closed. Armament also had to be strengthened. 2 rifle-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon were catastrophically insufficient for fighting heavy Soviet IL-2 assault aircraft and American flying fortresses. Additional cannons in underwing gondolas began to be fitted. This further weighed down the machine and ruined the aerodynamics. Instead of an elegant sports plane, they got a flying hedgehog, festooned with weaponry like a Christmas tree with ornaments. It became heavy to fly, but there was no other choice. Chapter 6. Economics versus engineering. And this brings us to the most important question. Why didn't the Germans phase out the Bf-109 and start producing something new? There were projects, after all. The Focke-Wulf 190, for instance, was an excellent machine, much loved by pilots for its ruggedness, powerful armament, and excellent handling. There were also more advanced developments from Messerschmitt himself, like the Me-209, which showed promising results. The answer lies in economics and politics. By 1943, Germany had switched to total war. Aircraft factories were working at full capacity, producing hundreds of planes per month. And the bulk of these were the Bf-109. Why? Because it was technologically efficient. Because its production was fine-tuned to an automatic process. Because thousands of workers and engineers knew this plane inside and out. Stopping the assembly line to launch a new model meant losing precious time and, most importantly, drastically reducing the number of machines produced. And quantity was becoming more important for Germany than quality. It was a strategic decision, and it was a mistake. The Americans could afford an arms race. They constantly improved the Mustang, which by the end of the war became the absolute king of the sky. In the USSR, we also didn't stand still. We launched the Yak-3 and La-7 into production, machines that, at low and medium altitudes where most dogfights occurred, were head and shoulders above any Gustav. The Germans, however, kept churning out Messers, trying to squeeze the last drops out of an outdated design. Imagine an old athlete trying to run 100 meters with 50 kilograms of weight on his back. His heart might still manage, but his joints and ligaments won't. That was the Gustav. It had an engine as powerful as a young man's, but wings and landing gear like a feeble old man's. The aerodynamics of the plane, especially the late series, were hopelessly ruined by those bulges, bumps, and external stores. It became unresponsive to controls. Our yaks easily outmaneuvered it in turns, and while it might be fast in a dive, pulling out of that dive under high G-load became harder and harder. Willy Messerschmitt, being a neurotic and a man who stubbornly defended his ideas to the end, refused to admit his creation was obsolete. He continued to fight with the aviation ministry, arguing that the Bf 109 was the best. He fought for every order, for every engine. And his stubbornness largely led to Germany not having a modern, mass-produced, balanced fighter capable of competing on equal terms with the Mustangs, Tempests, and LA-7s by the war's end. Chapter 7. Conclusions. How it really was. So what verdict can we reach? Was the Bf 109 a bad plane? No, of course not. At the beginning of its journey, it was a revolutionary, a breakthrough, a machine that set the direction for the development of global fighter aviation for years to come. The Bf 109E and Bf 109F were magnificent examples of engineering, balanced and deadly. But by the end of the war, it was a deep old man, trying to pass for a youth with heavy makeup and plastic surgery. Its design, brilliant for a light sports aircraft, proved incapable of carrying the weaponry and armor load required of a total warfighter. The narrow landing gear track, the weak torsion wing, the cramped cockpit, the impossibility of installing a bubble canopy without redesigning the entire fuselage. All these childhood diseases had turned into chronic, incurable conditions. Amazingly, Messerschmitt, a brilliant designer of gliders and light aircraft, never managed to create a truly successful heavy fighter. His Me-210 and Me-410 were failures. And perfecting the Me-262, the first jet fighter, also encountered the same problems. Messerschmitt tried to use his single-spar wing there too, causing controllability issues at high speeds. His colleagues, like Kurt Tank, creator of the FW-190, or Alexander Yakovlev, proved more flexible. They understood that war isn't sport, and a fighter needs to be not just fast, but also survivable, easy to fly, have good visibility, and carry powerful armament. They learned from their mistakes and created new machines, rather than endlessly trying to modernize old ones. And here we return to our own perspectives. We often swing from one extreme to another. Either we sing praises to German quality and call the Messer the best plane of the war, or we trample it into the mud, claiming it only flew because of the high number of aces. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Yes, the Bf 109 was a formidable weapon. Yes, it was technologically efficient and produced in massive numbers. Yes, outstanding pilots flew it. But its fame is largely the merit of specific people, not the machine itself. Erich Hartmann shot down 352 planes not because his Bf 109 was perfect. He shot them down because he was a genius of aerial combat, and his plane, despite all its flaws, allowed him to do so. On a Yak-1 or La-5, he might have shot down 400. Instead of an epilogue, the man who couldn't stop. Willy Messerschmitt survived the war. He was convicted for using forced labor, spent time in prison, and then returned to aviation manufacturing in the New Germany. He consulted for the Spanish, built planes for Egypt, and participated in creating the European concern Airbus. But in history, he remains primarily as the creator of the Bf 109, an athlete of a plane that was forced to fight, a plane that traveled the path from triumph to catastrophe, from Spain to Berlin. The story is a lesson for us all. A lesson that brilliant simplicity doesn't always stand the test of time. A lesson that stubbornness and unwillingness to change can kill even the most brilliant idea. And a lesson that behind every plane, behind every victory and every catastrophe, there are people, designers, workers, engineers, pilots, with their own ambitions, talents, and mistakes. Well, friends, our deep dive into history has come to an end. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. I tried to show you this controversial veteran not as an icon and not as a scarecrow, but as a complex, living machine with its own ailments and advantages. And now, as promised, let's move on to the most interesting part, your opinion. I call you to action. Write in the comments what you think about the Bf 109. Do you agree that its development hit a dead end due to the designer's mistakes? Or do you think it was the best fighter of World War II with no equal? Which plane do you think was more balanced, the Yak or the Messer? Let's have a real battle in the comments, but with respect for each other. Argue your point, reference facts, debate, but don't insult your opponents. And, of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you love aviation, if you're interested in such in-depth analyses, then you definitely belong in our company. Hit the bell so you don't miss new episodes. We have a lot more interesting things ahead. We'll talk about the legendary IL-2, the mysterious La-7, the British Spitfire, and the American Mustang. We'll take them apart piece by piece, compare them, analyze them. Thank you for spending this long, but hopefully fascinating time with me. Take care, and see you next time.